Hi there, this is Keisha Rogers with your Saturday class and discussion. I'm going to be joined tonight by Brian Lantz, but this is an extraordinary time for our nation and for the world as President Trump has kept his promises, and his promise has been peace through strength to put an end to these endless wars. If you missed it today, Barbara Boyd reported on the very important developments of the accomplishments of President Trump on peace in the Middle East. And just as we were getting on this call, there were new reports going on of celebrations in the streets of Tel Aviv with President Trump's peace initiative with Hamas and with Israel. Also, that there is discussions that are happening right now with Ivanka Trump, Gerald, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Ivanka's husband, as well as Steve Witkoff and others who have been instrumental in the peace negotiations between in the Middle East between Israel, Hamas, and other nations. As President Trump said recently, that there is no one, no nation in that region who is not absolutely ecstatic and very praising, praising of what President Trump and what has been accomplished through these peace negotiations. Remember, peace through strength, that is President Trump's commitment to economic development, to growing the region again, and most emphatically, you have to grow the economic development within the United States. And that's going to be a key to making sure that we continue with these developments of peace. So, as we know, that's going on. And I think that Barbara's title in her opening presentation earlier, Trump crushing the empire with Middle East peace. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, I'd encourage you to watch that discussion from earlier. Things are taking off and continuing to happen rapidly. And she makes a point that while that is going on, the globalists launch economic chaos. So on one front, they're being defeated left and right. Their war policies are being defeated, and their economic policies are being defeated also as they continue to push chaos, as we're seeing right now with the insane policies coming from the Democrats around the shutdown of the government. I think we're on day 10 now, day 11. It's completely insane what they're calling for to continue with the globalist policies of the green agenda, environmentalism, giving health care to illegal immigrants, and just destroying our cities. This is a big factor that's going on right now in terms of the insanity coming from the governor and mayor in Chicago and Illinois, and then also what you have just happening in cities around the nation where they are pushing for these insane policies. But what we're going to talk about tonight, and that's why we have Brian Lantz on. He is going to discuss how we got into this mess economically and what it's going to take to get out of it to truly fulfill President Trump's agenda of making America great again. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Brian Lantz, and then I'll have Tony's going to help out with the slides in the background here. But let me see if I can get him highlighted. Tony, can you do that for me, please?
You bet.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you, Keisha. Thank you, Tony. You can put up the first slide. I'm referring back to Ulysses. If you ever dived into Homer's Ulysses, into the Odyssey, I think Trump is captaining our ship right now between Scylla and Charybdis, between the monsters, or as this illustration puts it, between monsters and the deep. to bring us through to safety. And I think what we're really dealing with here on the level of cultural war in the United States, I think it's very important to just illuminate this, is we're really dealing with a duality. You can go to the next slide. If for a simpler example, from Alice in Wonderland, we're dealing with Tweedledee and Tweedledum, or you could say Tweedledee and Tweedledum and Dumber. That this duality, on the one hand, of so-called free market libertarian um, uh, uh, speculation, junk bonds, big tech bros, financialization and offshoring. That's been one track. That's one set of monsters, if you will. On the other hand, we've had I think it's the obvious that the neoliberal, uh, actually fascist in many ways, green agenda, the imposition of from the top down in terms of hijacking the federal and even state government to impose an environment that prevents all investment, as Keisha was just referring to, in terms of creating a horrendous situation in a number of our cities, such as Chicago and Portland, DEI, and the rest. Just for reference, in terms of what I'm going to be developing tonight, you can take the next slide. My book is available on Amazon and at the bookstore with Promethean Action, 450 pages, a deep dive sector by sector into the U.S. economy. It was released back the day of the election, November 5th of last year, on Amazon. And I urge you to dive into that. And the next slide is my Substack, and that's physical economics. It's Brian Lantz .substack.com. It's free, and you can see the latest piece there. Charlie Kirk, lack of affordable homes, a political volcano, and that's an article on home ownership. I'm going to be dealing with that some tonight. Home ownership is so critical. Affordable home ownership for our young families, who right now are taking the brunt of the housing crisis and the pricing of rents and housing through the stratosphere. At the same time, they're dealing with the pay now, buy now, pay later swindles in terms of financing and debt that Charlie Kirk also highlighted as what is creating a political volcano among our young people, a political volcano that will turn to the Mandamis of the world, the candidate for mayor in New York, if not given a positive direction, a role to play in creating a better future, not only for themselves, but their families. And that brings us to healthcare. But before I talk a bit about healthcare, I want to just touch on housing, which, as I said, is a critical issue. And I just want to add an update here on it. You can drop that slide for right now, Tony. The housing situation. President Trump, October 4th, that was last Sunday, I believe, October 4th or 5th, maybe it was the 5th, had a piece on his Truth Social. He said, before I became president, OPEC kept oil prices high. It wasn't right for them to do that, but in a different form is being done again, this time by the big home builders of our nation. He continued, they're my friends, and they're very important to the success of our country. But now they can get financing, and they have to start building homes. They're sitting on 2 million empty lots, a record. And I can confirm that's, well, first of all, the main point, I think, is Trump is not saying that the whole problem with housing is local zoning. He's not saying that this is something where you can just create a free market and houses will get built. We're dealing with something different here. We're dealing with an OPEC of sorts, stymieing housing construction. So this is a very open-ended uh, 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 line of attack on the part of President Trump. Clearly, he's intent on home building. Secretary of Treasury Besant said, we may very well declare a housing emergency this fall, a national housing emergency to organize a construction program. We'll see how that plays out. And other steps are being taken by the Trump administration in this direction. Of course, as I mentioned before in the last broadcast here on the 20th of September, the presidential campaign of Robert Kennedy Jr. called for lowering mortgages to 3%, creating a program for first-time home buyers from all walks of life, and that the bonds should be sold, bonds that were tax exempt, to raise funds that would fund this mortgage program, very much like the veterans program after World War II. So there's thinking with the Trump administration along these lines, and that's very important. The second point I just wanted to make briefly on housing before moving on is there are over 2 million lots held by the big home builders. These home builders, by the way, these are the publicly traded home builders. These are Wall Street home builders. This is Lennar, and it's D.R. Horton, Pulte Homes. There's others. But, for example, just to give you some figures, this is figures from 2022, the latest that I could find. Horton then held 574,000 lots, either owned them outright or controlled them. The Lennar had 481,000 homes. Pulte Group had 234,000 homes. So the list goes on, but you get the idea. And besides owning, they either have options on this, they're paying a farmer a certain amount a month to hold the land, and then when they're ready, they'll take it, they'll purchase it from them. These are binding contracts, or what's called land banking, where companies specialize the land banking. It's a field now of operations. Hold land for specific builders on contract, may even begin the development of the land, including roads and so forth, and then move to hand it over when that builder is ready. These big builders that build entire subdivisions. So Trump is absolutely right about this. Obviously, we've got to get interest rates down. That's the Federal Reserve. They play a big role in the mess we're in right now. And I'm going to turn now to healthcare. The next slide just is an introduction to that topic. Here we're really dealing, first of all, I think we've got to keep in mind, and I'm sure President Trump has this in mind, we're talking about the right to life in the constitutional sense of that term, right to life. And healthcare is critical to that. And we're also talking about the sacred, I would call it sacred, relationship of physician and patient. That specific relationship that has to be defended. It has to be the basis of how we move forward to solve the healthcare crisis in the country. You can take that slide down, Tony. The government shutdown right now, Keisha referred to it. The Democrats are making a lot of noise that somehow President Trump, who right now is saving lives in the Middle East and working to save lives in Ukraine, that he is attempting to throw Americans, vulnerable Americans, off of health care in some form. And of course, this is completely ridiculous. This is not at all what's going to go on. And I want to get into the Tweedledee, Tweedledum nature of left versus right, free market versus overriding top-down, liberalism, socialism, fascism that we're dealing with right now, as it reflects itself in healthcare. The entire healthcare system, is not going. The problems are not going to be solved by throwing everybody, off of healthcare. And as numbers of libertarians and extreme right, far right, Wall Street types would want, and it's not going to be solved, obviously, with more socialism. We've got a real problem on our hand. The healthcare system has been financialized. This wasn't the case. This wasn't the case up until the 1970s. We didn't have this enormous blob sitting on top of the healthcare system, this network of major insurers, HMOs, PPOs, and so forth. That didn't exist. We now have a healthcare system, ironically, that is publicly financed, but it's investor owned. It's a complete overturning of what existed as a result of the Hill-Burton legislation that was passed after World War II that supported local government, state governments, county governments in the development of hospitals, hospital beds, and doctors and nurses across the country. It supported them. It was run through the states. It built up the hospital system that exists today, still exists, fragile, but still exists through communities throughout the United States. This was a nonprofit hospital system and a public health hospital system. Nonprofits, the hospital system, it was Catholic, the Catholic Church, Methodists, those of the Jewish faith, Lutherans, so forth, Presbyterian. They all sponsored nonprofit hospitals in neighboring communities across the country. Virtually every town and city had some kind of hospital and was sponsored in that fashion. Then, of course, you had county hospitals and so forth that came in addition. That was subsidized, supported by Hill-Burton, and we built the system up from the ground up. But that was changed in the 1970s, beginning with the HMO system. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details. You can read about it. It's easy enough to find these days on the internet. But it's estimated, that now we're spending 70% of public health care expenditure. 70% of healthcare expenditure is by government, by the public, taxpayers through the government. You can go to, just a moment on that. The point is, in converting to a free market insurance company run system, if you take HMOs, for example, health maintenance organizations, health maintenance organization like Kaiser, as it developed out on the West Coast, Kaiser, it contracted with a set of hospitals, or actually built hospitals itself. It contracted with doctors. They received a fixed amount of money, and they treated the people that were members of that HMO system. And you had to go to your primary provider in that system to get a referral to a specialist. So the primary providers essentially operated as gatekeepers. And the whole idea was to keep prices down. And so this idea was picked up, and taken nationwide, if you will, to say, okay, we're going to control inflation. We're going to control the rising cost of healthcare. Well, in fact, and you've heard this story. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in terms of my notes, but you probably have heard this story that it's the fancy new medical devices, it's the new diagnostics, it's the new non-invasive surgery, and so on and so forth. All of this is increasing the cost of healthcare astronomically, and this is the problem. This is the problem. Too much fancy medical care. And I want to submit right now, and I think it's important to get some clarity on this, that if we still had a producer economy, remember, 1971 was when the dollar came out the gold standard. The U.S. economy was being turned into the service economy, the so-called post-industrial economy that was being discussed. Industrialism was viewed as a war machine by the anti-war movement. This is the era of the Vietnam War and so forth. But so we're in the process of taking down Wall Street, the City of London, Wall Street, the central banking system, the Council on Foreign Relations, Project 1980 spelled this out. We're in the process of a controlled disintegration of the U.S. as an industrial economy. So as we converted to a service economy, well, the problem was what we were not producing. If we were a productive economy, if we were still a growing, creative, bustling, productive economy with growing families, neighborhoods, and real prosperity, we would have thrown off the surplus. We would have created the wealth that would have easily paid for the healthcare advances that were being made. The substance here of this is that in areas of the real physical economy, there's no way of avoiding actual capital investment. Healthcare requires real capital investment. You can't just paper it over with gatekeepers and financial manipulation. You couldn't even do it with AI. You've got to actually capital invest. That is human resources, physical resources. And that's the same in every other area, like energy, for example. You've got to actually invest. You can't live on air. But that was what was happening. Inflation took off in the United States, growing quickly. By mid-1970s, it was at roughly 10, 11% interest. Overall inflation in the country. Healthcare inflation was actually less than that rate at that point. So healthcare was not the problem. But we said, we got to stop inflation. And so we're going to convert to this efficient free market system. We're going to let companies run on a profit motive, healthcare on a profit motive. That had not been the American system of healthcare. Healthcare was not looked at as something to make a profit on. The local nonprofit hospital, that's what the local doctors used if they needed it for surgery or to refer to specialists. The doctor ran his own practice, maybe with just a secretary or a nurse. The fees were low. Most of it was paid out of pocket. And then, of course, there was employer insurance that had come along during World War II. And so that was another factor. But it wasn't a factor in terms of increasing expenses. It was a system that delivered health care at the local level directly. The primacy of the patient, doctor, physician relationship. That's what ruled. That's how the system was organized. We threw that out. So instead, we're going to let profits be made on healthcare. Supposedly, that would drive efficiency because the HMOs and then the PPOs and the insurance companies and so on and so forth would make their money by cutting costs. They supposedly could be more efficient. Well, in fact, we ended up subsidizing a growing healthcare cost. You can go to the next slide, if you will, Tony.
Sure.
This just so where are we today? We're in a situation where this is from a recent study published about a year and a half ago. Looking at healthcare over a century, we're now at a point where 70%, as I mentioned, of healthcare expenditures are borne by the public, by taxpayer dollars. And part of it is hidden. The red line here is what, is paid through Medicare, Medicaid, directly by the government. But the higher rate that goes up to 70% is the hidden costs. For example, 50% of Americans are on Advantage programs now, a little over 50%. That's subsidized by the government. One estimate, measured, thoughtful estimate by professionals is that $83 billion in federal government money went to Advantage plans, not as recompense, not to repay them for services rendered, but above that, to keep the Advantage plans profitable. So 25% of public subsidies are hidden from the public, in the sense that it's not direct. It's not for your to pay back for your use of your Advantage plan with your local doctor, your provider, but to subsidize a system that was put in place supposedly to save us money. It's doing the opposite. And so you can take that slide down. But the cost of healthcare today, 40% of expenditures on healthcare, 40 to 50% is in overhead. Overhead. It has nothing to do with delivering healthcare in the sense of doctors and nurses and patients and hospitals. It's in overhead. There's other features to the situation we have today that are also that have compounded this. So this is what, just to mention a couple, we don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. We haven't expanded, even with the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, which expanded the number of people on Medicaid. It did not create more doctors. It's the same number of doctors, more or less, but there's more people with a plastic card seeking medical care. That's why the quality of medical care is going down. You have less and less time with your doctor, for example. If you go to for an appointment, in all likelihood, you're there for 10 or 15 minutes. Further, the federal government, in coming out of COVID, provided an additional subsidy to Medicaid, but also to the Affordable Care Act platform, to the marketplace, the Obamacare marketplace, which helped people sign on or continue to get health care under the Affordable Care Act through the marketplace. Well, those subsidies are running out. President Trump and the Republican leadership are more than willing to negotiate a solution, because it's projected, there's some hysteria involved, but it's projected these prices could jump 75%, that people could see a 75% jump, in their costs or more. These additional subsidies came through the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan during COVID. But this is being manipulated politically around the shutdown, when in fact it's a non-issue. The president, wants the Republican Party leadership wants to ensure health care for Americans. So I'm on health care. and I've covered Burton a bit on this, but obviously, if you step back and look at it, and this is a tangle to be undone, we have a few things to build on, and I'll just leave it at this for now. We can come back another time to healthcare in a more detailed fashion. But just to touch on a couple of elements, most community health hospitals today are still nonprofit. There's more privately owned hospitals now than there are publicly owned hospitals. That's an inversion. But still, somewhere around 60% of all hospitals are nonprofits. That's something to build on. That's dates back to Hill-Burton, and the laws governing nonprofit hospitals have been weakened. I mean, it's not the same. They need to be tightened, so they actually are nonprofit and functioning in the traditional sense. But that's something to build on. We also have the veterans healthcare system nationally, which functions, and President Trump has made a significant effort, both in his first and second term, to develop and improve that system for all veterans. And that plays a leading role, including in training of new doctors. We also need to expand the number of medical schools in all likelihood. We definitely have to expand the number of doctors coming out of our programs. And that means the CMS system that oversees Medicare and Medicaid and provides for residencies has to be funded by Congress to increase the number of residencies so that we actually produce a growing number of doctors again. That was really originally slashed with the Inflation Reduction of years ago, if I have the name of it correct. Let me just see if I can find it's the Balanced Budget Act. That was of 1997 that cut residencies, cut CMS money for residencies, and therefore cut the number of hospitals or number of doctors that were being trained. So we've got work to do, but we got things to build on. And obviously, overall, we need to strip away this overlay. I'm not, there's a question of divestment. There's a question of how you overhaul this and move it back down to the state and local level. That's what I would say myself in terms of how we have to move forward on healthcare. But this is a deep problem. It was promoted by going with Tweedledee and Tweedledum. On the one hand, it was government that set up the HMO and privatization for-profit system. It's the for-profit system that does not work to create healthcare, but it's the American system, as embodied by Hill-Burton, as embodied by a collaboration of private with public, local government, and so forth, that can recreate a future. And another element that I would just mention is the divestment of equity funds of doctors' practices. Doctors' practices are being taken over. Doctors are retiring early. They're trying to get out of the business. They can't make money. Medicare and Medicaid do not pay enough recompense to cover their costs. And so they want out. But we've got to reverse that process by cutting that overhead, delivering healthcare directly to our practitioners, and obviously to the American citizenry. So let me move then to agriculture, another area. We've talked a little about housing. We're talking about the healthcare crisis and finding a way out of it here. Now we're moving to agriculture, another example. Here again, the crisis in agriculture originally dates back to the 1950s when the parity system, the parity farm system, was taken apart in 1952. Through the war years, 1942 to 1952, we had a parity house system that placed a floor under farm prices. I'm not going to go into the details of it. It's covered in my book. You can find it otherwise. But we had a system that put a floor under farm price, 90% of parity. Parity was, the point where the farmer was covering all his costs plus making a decent profit. Profit being what he reinvested in his farm to improve it and so forth. 90% of parity was established under federal law, and that saw us through World War II and into the 1950s. It was replaced increasingly by a system of market pricing, and supposedly this was going to lower food costs. Well, you look today at what we've got coming out of this. At the same time, of course, not so widely understood, perhaps, is that on the flip side, of course, farmers, ranchers, and farmers have been clobbered as well by the federal rulemaking, green agenda, and so forth that's chipped away. The Endangered Species Act has removed land from grazing. The Food and Safety Modernization Act imposed increasing compliance burdens. Federal Land Policy Management Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. I'm just naming these just to give you a sense. But you take the Clean Water Act under rulemaking with the APA. A farmer's pond, was claimed to be something that fell under the jurisdiction of the federal government. If they could show that pond, some of the water from that pond trickled into a stream, which went into a creek, which then went into a river, and therefore was part of the waters of the United States. That's a term, waters of the United States. So a farmer's pond came under federal jurisdiction, and farmers went to prison for trying to defend their right to not only feed their cattle, service their cattle, but for fire control. This has been the other side, this regulatory strictures put around our productive farmers and farm families. And that's got to be obviously, undone. But I want to focus here and just give a few examples of what the consequence of this so-called market reforms of market pricing has been as it's rolled in wave after wave. And of course, subsidies to farmers substituted for parity. I can come back to that, but that doesn't work. 85% of subsidies go to 15% of farmers. Most farmers never see these quote unquote subsidies. It's basically soybean, corn, and a few other growers that get most of the subsidies, the big ag. But let me go through a few examples of what happened with market pricing as this is rolled in, as you see it in the grocery store. Let's take beef, for example. Since 1995, so that's 30 years, there's been only 4 meatpacking giants, a cartel. The Iowa State University showed this in 2022. It's an important, rather famous study showing multi-plant coordination, i.e., these 4 companies, Tyson's Food, Cargill, National Beef, Marfrig, that's one name, and JBS USA, carved up meatpacking across the country. They carved it up. They didn't interfere with each other. They each had their own turf, more or less, regionally organized. And a rancher with cattle or a calving operation, and then sold to intermediary for further raising of the cattle, and then on to a feedlot. Ultimately, there was only one place for that for that head of cattle to be sold, and it was at the slaughterhouse facility. And there was one buyer. The buyer for that slaughterhouse facility, that was the one place he could go. The auction system of selling cattle at an auction has basically disappeared. There, at least, there was competition, between more than one buyer. That's disappeared in this process. So this is not abstract. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against AgriStats, Inc., a statistical company. What would that have to do with pricing? Well, they organized and managed anti-competitive information between the big four, right? The big four exchanges on pricing, cost, production among these processors, these what I call meat packer plants, but processors for not only beef but turkey, poultry, etc. And they settled. In 2025, AgStats was forced to end these anti-competitive prices. They were basically banned from compiling the statistics. Price fixing settlements, JBS USA, that's Brazil-based, one of the big four, has had multiple settlements. February 2025 of this year, $83.5 million settlement with cattle producers and cattle futures traders for price fixing. Right? This goes on and on. There's multiple cases. Litigation again exists against Tyson Foods, Cargill, National Beef. This is known, and this is an important aspect of this. And this is something that the Trump administration is clearly continuing. How it will shape up, we'll see. But starting with Lena Khan, who is backed by Republicans like J.D. Vance, Lena Khan there, the chair of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. She's now been replaced, but she got in there one way or another under Biden, and she pursued antitrust actions, continuing the antitrust actions of the first Trump administration against big tech, against Meta and so forth, Apple. Those lawsuits are continuing as well against this process of monopoly and oligopoly, which grows out of so-called free trade. It's really a flea market, not a free market. But these antitrust actions are a very important part of reining in under existing laws. This isn't new laws. This is the 1921 Packers and Stockyard Act. That's 1921. The Packers and Stockyard Act outlawed these monopolistic practices. And we're only beginning to straighten out our court system to get back to enforcing these antitrust laws. It's extremely important. That's just briefly on beef. Seeds and agrochemicals. They began, the original U.S. Department of Agriculture spent 1/3 of its entire budget on providing seeds, gathering and providing seeds to farmers across the United States. But in 1930, you saw the Plant Patent Act that gave plant breeders the right to patenting new varieties of seed, asexually produced crops, and so forth. And then a series of Supreme Court decisions. The result of this was that today, as you may be aware, a handful of companies, 4 companies, control almost all of the seed and agrochemical business. Bayer, which acquired Monsanto, is the largest. Corteva, that you may not be familiar with that name, but that was the merger of Dow and DuPont. And Chem China, which bought the Swiss-based Syngenta. Those 3 companies, Bayer, Corteva, and Chem China, dominate the seed and petrochemical industry globally. And so as a consequence, the price of seed rose 270% between 1990 and 2020. This while commodity prices only rose 56%. And that's not even what the farmers got. They got less than that. But they had to buy these inputs at these rising prices. Fertilizer is another example. Mosaic controls phosphate. CF Industries controls nitrogen. Nutrien controls 55% of domestic potash mining and 40% of the potassium fertilizer sales. It's, this dominates. And then there's ethanol, which I won't really spend time on tonight. We have a limited amount of time here. But think of ethanol. We're growing 45% roughly of the corn we're growing today is going for ethanol. We're burning food for fuel. There's no necessity for this. It's lower octane. You get fewer miles out of it. Of course, we have a 10% additive. I think it's 10.1 nationally in terms of ethanol added to our gas tanks. But this is an enormous amount of our agricultural land resources, human labor that's going into producing ethanol for the country, burning food for fuel. And this is, you can stack this up to the Tweedledum of government intervention, starting with, of course, Jimmy Carter and the energy crisis being the moral equivalent of war, and how that's come down to today. But ethanol, of course, is supporting the corn growers, which is the largest single crop producer in the country by dollar amount. So those are features of the situation. Just briefly, I'll mention energy. Of course, I think it's pretty obvious, but it may not be, because our collective memory is not so great necessarily. If you take energy, of course, the Trump administration again here is moving to bust open and grow energy production, double our grid, to move from 1.1 to 2.2 and then more terawatts of energy, of electrical power in the country. They're intent on that. Then they've stopped the shutting down of coal plants, which was being imposed via the EPA and other environmental measures. Rulemaking, unconstitutional rulemaking, as the Supreme Court ultimately has decided. Very important decisions. So that's extremely important. But we moved away back, I'll say roughly the 1990s, roughly 2000. That was a key kind of turning point, 2000. We turned away from a system of utilities, public and private utilities, located locally for local energy markets with power plants relatively nearby to their use. And we deregulated the entire electrical grid system of the United States from the standpoint, again, of saying, oh, well, we can increase efficiency. But again, this was in the context of a collapsing U.S. economy. We were a service economy. And with the deregulation of electrical production and creating basically an auction market where sellers could come and bid to provide energy today, nobody invested in tomorrow. We stopped capital investment in energy production. What did that lead to? Well, that led to utilities and energy producers saying, oh, well, we're going to go with wind and solar because we can build it basically overnight. And if we get subsidies from the federal government to do it, we can get a lot of energy online quick. Of course, it costs a hell of a lot. It uses more resources. it doesn't operate 24/7, right? The wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine 24/7. And in the process of deregulating and going to renewables, we undermine the entire grid of the United States. We're now trying to build our way out of that mess. But that was all done from the standpoint of privatizing energy, doing away with public utilities in large parts of the country, and converting utility companies, otherwise like NextEra in Florida, into hybrid companies, or uh, others are Southern Company and Duke Energy. They're hybrid. They're utilities, but they own entire branches separately that sell energy on the national market, or a multi-state market. And so you have this crazy quelled system of speculative markets, commodity markets, as you have now with agriculture, that play on shortages, manipulate shortages, um, um, and the same has occurred with energy. Enron was the perfect example of this. The Enron that was backed by George W. Bush and company. So again, this is where we're coming out of. We're sailing our ship, you know, um, between the devil and the deep blue sea. We're sailing it through with the American system. There's lots of problems still to solve. The answers are not all necessarily clear. President Trump has a handle on this. He's got a growing and excellent team of people collaborating with him, as we see now in the outcomes to date with the ceasefire between Gaza and Israel, between Hamas and Israel. And the same is occurring domestically with as we build out our manufacturing again, we build out our energy infrastructure, we begin to produce again. As President Trump has emphasized, we're going to grow our way out of this crisis. As we grow our way out of this crisis, we can pay for health care. We don't have to pay for it from the top, but we can generate the wealth in terms of wages, uh, um, the profits in terms of companies to support a growing and advanced healthcare system for all Americans. We can do it with the minimum of overhead. We're doing the same thing in energy. We can solve the housing crisis, get the interest rates down, get down to 3% in terms of mortgages by hook or crook, as we did after World War II. I went through this on September 20th here. We can do these things. So I'm going to stop there, open up the floor. I'm sure I've provoked a lot of thinking, and I'm sure pieces of this people already knew, but I hope it kind of giving an overview, stepping back and trying to give an overview of Tweedledee and Tweedledum and Dumber, that we recognize what we're about now as a nation as we dig ourselves out of this hole. So thank you for your attention, and I certainly welcome your questions. And thank you, Tony, for helping with the slides.